all of the numbers. It's just one big sham, it's one big fraud. All the above mentioned cases, the ones that my firm dealt with, a very serious fraud committed by German companies, faded to nothing in view of the extent of the damage that the corona crisis has caused and continues to cause. This corona crisis, according to all we know today, must be renamed the corona scandal or a PCR test scandal. And those responsible for it must be criminally prosecuted and sued for civil damages. On a political level, everything must be done to make sure that no one will ever be in a position to make this happen again. And for this reason, I will now explain to you how and where an international network of lawyers will argue this probably biggest tort case ever, the corona fraud scandal, which has meanwhile unfolded into probably the greatest crime against humanity ever committed. Crimes against humanity were first defined in connection with the so-called Nuremberg trials. They came after World War II, when they dealt with the main war criminals of the Third Reich, many of whom escaped, many of whom either went to Russia or to the United States. This is the so-called Operation Paperclip. One of them is probably the father of the American space program. Werner von Braun is his name, Werner von Braun. Another group of war criminals founded the MK-Ultra program, mind control program that the CIA used to work with, and many say it still works with. So that's where this term comes from the Nuremberg trials. And they also dealt with not just one trial. The one trial that got the most attention is the one that dealt with the main war criminals, but there's also the other trials that dealt with the doctors who did all these terrible experiments, medical experiments, and who were then as now an integral part of these crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity are today regulated in Section 7 of the International Criminal Code. So the three major questions to be answered in the context of the judicial approach to the corona scandal are, how dangerous is the virus really? And that's something that I found very puzzling, that nobody ever wanted an answer to that one. They just accepted that this is a novel, really dangerous coronavirus. But we wanted to know, how dangerous is the virus really? Is it really one of the most dangerous viruses ever? Or is it comparable to the common flu? Second question, how reliable is the PCR test? Specifically, does a positive PCR test result mean that the person tested is infected with COVID-19? Or does it mean absolutely nothing in connection with the COVID-19 infection? And thirdly, do the so-called anti-corona measures, such as the lockdown, mandatory face masks, and quarantine regulations, and above all, of course, the so-called vaccinations, do they really serve to protect the world's population from corona? Or do these measures serve only to make people panic, so that they believe, without asking any questions, that their lives are in danger, so that in the end, the pharmaceutical and tech industries can generate huge profits from the sale of PCR tests, antigen and antibody tests, and so-called vaccines, as well as the harvesting of our genetic fingerprints. There is a fourth question that is of particular importance for Germany. Is it true that the German government was massively lobbied, more so than any other country, by the chief protagonists of this, so-called corona pandemic? Those are the German professor Drosten of Charité University in a hospital in Berlin. His name will come up over and over again. And then there's another professor, Wheeler, of the German equivalent of the American CDC, the Robert Koch Institute, RKI, of Germany. And then there's, of course, Mr. Tedros, Dr. Tedros. Everybody thinks he's a doctor, a medical doctor. No, he's not. He's the head of the World Health Organization. Did they apply special pressure, or did they lobby massively in Germany? Because Germany is known as a particularly disciplined country. And was it chosen by these protagonists and their handlers as a role model for their strict and, of course, successful adherence to the corona measures? That's quite a distinct possibility. When I was beginning to ask myself these questions, my wife, Inka, and I were still staying at our ranch in Northern California. out in the middle of nowhere, because that's where I wanted to be, away from everything and everybody. I was intent to stay there and sit things out rather than go back to Germany, where I had, after 28 years of practice as a trial lawyer representing consumers and small and medium-sized businesses against large corrupt corporations, where I had lost all faith in the judiciary. But my wife persuaded me to go back and do something. That's what she said, do something. Yeah. And eventually, I called my friend, Dr. Wolfgang Woda. He's an experienced lung specialist and had, in fact, as I pointed out earlier, stopped the other side's first attempt at a pandemic, the swine flu of 2009. And he stopped it almost single-handedly because he was then, as a member of the German Bundestag, it's like Congress, and of the Council of Europe in a position of political power. He managed to expose that scam after about a year of fear-mongering by showing that it was just a mild flu. On that fateful call that I had with Wolfgang, he explained this to me and he said, "This looks like the swine flu 2.0. We must do something." I said, "Yeah, that's what my wife told me." But he said, "Come back to Germany and we'll set up something in order to find out, in order to get to the heart of the matter." I said, "I can do that, but I need some help. I can't be the only one." And it turns out there was no one, not even in my firm, there was no one who was willing to take a closer look, because even at that early stage of that pandemic, many people were scared to death, to lose their jobs, to get all kinds of pushback. But he put me in touch with Vivian Fischer, who managed to get more than 80,000 signatures for a petition asking for a baseline study, which was designed to find out what exactly are we dealing with and what exactly needs to be done. It was obvious by the time we got back to Germany at the end of May of 2020 that our government, or what we thought was our government, and our mainstream media would not give us any answers to any of our questions. Why is that? Well, as it turns out, the mainstream media have all been bought by the people who are behind this pandemic or pandemic. And our politicians are their politicians, not just our German politicians, but yours, the Canadians, etc. The World Economic Forum, which is the most important platform for everything that is happening right now with respect to the infamous Great Reset, which this is part of, Corona pandemic, has been engaged in a that's how I phrase it, in a hostile takeover of our governments for at least 3 decades. Why is that? Well, the World Economic Forum was invented by Klaus Schwab, the bad guy, not my friend Martin Schwab. It was invented in 1971. At least that's what most people think, and I used to think that too. However, there's more to it. As our experts have explained to us, Klaus Schwab had met Henry Kissinger at Harvard when he went there in the 1960s. And Henry Kissinger, through a CIA-funded program, had built up Klaus Schwab as the person through which the US would try to influence European politics. The World Economic Forum's members consist of 1,000 large global corporations with annual sales of at least $5 billion, politicians, and media people. Since 1992, the World Economic Forum and its backers, including, of course, Klaus Schwab, but there's others, have been engaged in what they call the Young Global Leaders Program, which produces the politicians whom we think we're electing into public office. Among the first to graduate in 1992 were Angela Merkel and Bill Gates. But there were many more products of this program that became their political leaders. Tony Blair of Great Britain, Aznar, the former Prime Minister of Spain, or more recently, Jacinda Ardern, I think is her name, of New Zealand, Macron of France, former Chancellor Kurz of Austria, Justin Trudeau of Canada, and many, many more. In fact, Klaus Schwab openly boasts in a video that the World Economic Forum had managed to thoroughly penetrate or infiltrate the Canadian government and controlled half of their representatives there. Let me give you a summary of the facts as they present themselves today. The most important thing in a lawsuit is to establish the facts, that is, to find out what actually happened. That is because the application of the law always depends on the facts at issue. For example, if I want to prosecute someone for fraud, I cannot do that by presenting the facts of a car accident. So what happened here regarding the alleged corona pandemic? What happened really? The facts that I now describe are to a large extent the result of the work of the Berlin Corona Investigative Committee, the one that I founded with my friend Vivian Fischer on July 10th of 2020 in order to determine, through hearing expert testimony of international scientists and other experts, which asks how dangerous is the virus really, what's the significance of the positive PCR test, and what collateral damage has been caused by the corona measures, both with respect to the world's population's health and, of course, with respect to the world's economy. So what happened in May of 2019 and then in early 2020, and what happened 12 years earlier with the swine flu, to put this in perspective. In May of 2019, this is a little less than a year before it all started, or it seemed to start, the stronger of the two parties which ruled Germany in a grand coalition, the CDU, Christian Democratic Union, it's sort of like the Republicans, they claim, they held a Congress on global health, strangely called global health security, as if the military had something to do with it. Well, the military does have a lot to do with it, as we now know. Our Department of Health is really run by a general. Apparently, this was done at the instigation of important players from the pharmaceutical industry and the tech industry. At this Congress, which is a party Congress on global health, the usual suspects, you might say, gave their speeches. Angela Merkel was there, the German Secretary of Health, Jens Spahn, who's also a product of the above-mentioned Young Global Leaders Program. But some other people whom no one would have necessarily expected to be present at such a gathering were also there. Professor Drosten, virologist from Charité University in Berlin and Germany's chief healthcare advisor to the government, but also Professor Wieler, he runs the German equivalent of the CDC, as well as Mr. Tedros, head of the World Health Organization. They all gave speeches there. Also present and giving speeches were the chief lobbyists of the world's two largest healthcare funds, namely the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Wellcome Trust. Less than a year later, these very people called the shots in the proclamation of the worldwide corona pandemic and made sure that mass PCR screening of perfectly healthy people was used to create cases. I'll explain in a bit what that means. Based on these cases, which turn out to be mostly false positive test results that have nothing to do with infections, the World Health Organization was able to declare a public health emergency of international concern. Public health emergency of international concern. The acronym spells fake. I don't think that's an accident. It's in your face. They do it in your face. So they use these cases to declare a public health emergency of international concern, which in turn would be the basis on which to use untested new drugs, the so-called vaccines on people. This needs to be emphasized. The mostly false positive test results that the PCR tests delivered were the sole and only justification for worldwide lockdowns, social distancing, and mandatory face masks. Everything is based on these PCR test results. But most importantly, they're also the only basis for the so-called vaccinations. And that is in effect what they really needed the PCR test for, the creation of cases. And based on these cases, the resulting declaration of a public health emergency of international concern. They needed it for the vaccinations because it's the only justification for the use of totally untested new drugs on people. You need an emergency, so they created one. Everything else, apart from the vaccines, the mask mandates, the social distancing, the lockdowns, was part of a well-thought-out agenda of deliberately creating panic by making people believe that there's a health crisis and there was none. Making people walk around wearing masks that make them look like fools, imposing lockdowns and social distancing, and fining people who don't comply, makes them believe that there must be a really good reason for all of these measures, namely a public health emergency of international concern, a pandemic. It is important to note at this point that the definition of a pandemic was changed by the World Health Organization some 13 years ago. That was, they changed it in order to be able to make any flu into a pandemic. Until then, a pandemic was considered to be a disease that spread worldwide, which led to many serious illnesses and many deaths. 3 elements. Suddenly, for reasons never explained, it was supposed to be a worldwide disease only. Many serious illnesses and many deaths were not required anymore. So, due to this change, the World Health Organization, which is, of course, as all of you know, closely intertwined with the global pharmaceutical industry and with Bill Gates, was able to declare the swine flu pandemic in 2009, with the result that vaccines, even then, vaccines were produced and sold worldwide on the basis of contracts that have been kept secret until today. Unlike the newer contracts, many of them were leaked. They're totally ridiculous. They're void ab initio, as we lawyers say. They're totally void. But it must have been the same back then, except we don't know it for sure because we still don't know what's in these contracts. These vaccines proved to be completely unnecessary because the swine flu, as noted above, finally turned out to be a mild flu and never became the horrific plague that the pharmaceutical industry and its affiliated universities kept announcing it would turn into, with millions of deaths certain to happen if people don't get vaccinated. These vaccines also led to serious health problems, even back then. About 1,300 children in Europe, mostly in the Scandinavian countries, fell incurably ill with narcolepsy and are now forever severely disabled. The vaccines bought with millions of euros or dollars of taxpayers' money had to be destroyed with even more taxpayers' money. Already then, during the swine flu, the German virologist Drosten was one of those who stirred up panic in the population, repeating over and over again that the swine flu would claim many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of deaths all over the world unless everybody got vaccinated. In the end, it was mainly thanks to Dr. Wolfgang Wodak and his efforts as a member of the German Bundestag and also a member of the Council of Europe that this hoax was brought to an end before it could lead to even more serious consequences. Now, fast forward to March of 2020. When the German Bundestag announced what they call an epidemic situation of national importance, which is the same as the public health emergency of international concern, a health emergency. When they announced this in March of 2020, and based on this, the lockdown with the suspension of all essential constitutional rights for an unforeseeable time, there was only one single opinion on which the federal government, theirs, not ours, on which the federal government based its decision. In an outrageous violation of the universally accepted principle of, this is an old Roman legal principle, it's called audiatur et altera pars, which means you must listen to the other side also. Because there's always two sides to the story, sometimes many more. But in an outrageous violation of the universally accepted principle audiatur et altera pars, which means that one must also hear the other side, the only person they listened to was Drosten. That is the very person whose horrific, panic-inducing prognoses had proved to be catastrophically false 12 years earlier. He should have lost all credibility, but he was still there. Same is true for Fauci. We know now that this man, Professor Dr. Drosten, as he calls himself, is neither a real professor nor a real doctor. Rather, his professorship was given to him by one of the richest German families, the Quandt family, which owns BMW, for example. And according to two whistleblowers who took a deep dive into his academic credentials, his title as a doctor is based on a fake doctoral dissertation. All the real scientists who were even then speaking up and trying to warn the public about this fake pandemic, including Dr. Mike Yeadon, formerly of Pfizer, Professor John Ioannidis, one of the most quoted scientists in the world at Stanford University, as well as Professor Michael Levitt, a Nobel Prize winner for chemistry and also a biophysicist at Stanford University, Professor Sucharit Bhakti, now a good friend of mine, an immunobiologist and microbiologist, and many others were either ignored or, as happened with Dr. Wodak and Professor Bhakti, immediately framed as right-wing conspiracy theories, anti-Israel, all you know that. I'll talk some more about Dr. Mike Yeadon a little later. What's the current actual situation regarding the virus's danger, the complete uselessness of the PCR tests for the detection of infections, and the lockdowns based on non-existent infections? Well, in the meantime, we know that the healthcare systems were never in danger of being overwhelmed by COVID-19 patients. On the contrary, many hospitals, and this is not just true for Germany, this is true worldwide, many hospitals remain almost completely empty, waiting. We know that because many of the whistleblowers, many of the doctors who stepped forward and approached us, filmed what was going on in their hospitals with hidden cameras. Many hospitals remain completely empty, waiting for COVID patients to arrive, and collected a lot of money for doing that. The hospital ship, this is here in the US, the hospital ship Comfort, which anchored in New York at the time and could have accommodated 1,000 patients, never accommodated more than 20 patients. Nowhere was there any excess mortality. That's what the mainstream media and their politicians were trying to tell us, but there was no excess mortality anywhere. Studies carried out by Professor Ioannidis and others have shown that the mortality of the coronavirus, is equivalent, I'm talking about the mortality, is equivalent to that of the seasonal flu. I had corona, my wife had corona. It felt a little bit different from a regular flu, but ultimately it wasn't any worse. Even the World Health Organization agrees in the meantime that at a survival rate of 99.97 or 997%, the infection fatality rate of COVID being 0.14 or 0.15, this is roughly the same as that of the common flu. Now, many people think, oh, wait, no, that can't be, because we've seen pictures of Bergamo, New York. Well, even the pictures from Bergamo and New York, Bergamo, Italy, and New York, that were used to demonstrate to the world that panic was in order, proved to be deliberately misleading. Then, I'll explain about that. Then the so-called panic paper was leaked, which was written by the German Department of the Interior. Its content and similar papers exist in the UK, in Israel, and I suspect in the US as well. They may even be verbatim the same stuff. But this paper shows beyond a shadow of a doubt that, in fact, the population was deliberately driven to panic by politicians and mainstream media. The accompanying irresponsible statements of the head of the German equivalent of the CDC, the RKA, Wheeler, who repeatedly and excitedly announced that the corona measures must be followed unconditionally by the population without asking any questions, shows that they followed his script verbatim. In his public statements, he kept announcing that now, if you ask someone to do as they are ordered without asking any questions, that has nothing to do with democracy. It has nothing to do with science, because the basis of democracy and the basis of science is to ask questions. In his public statements, he kept announcing that the situation was very grave and threatening, although the figures compiled by his own institute proved the exact opposite. Among other things, the panic paper calls explicitly for children to be made to feel responsible for, this is a quote, for the painful death of their parents and grandparents if they do not follow the corona rules. That is if they don't wash their hands constantly, if they don't stay away from their grandparents. That's in this paper. And nobody's ever disputed its authenticity. It's real. A word of clarification as far as Bergamo is concerned. In Bergamo, the vast majority of the deaths, 94% to be exact, turned out to be the result not of COVID-19, but rather the consequence of the government deciding to transfer sick patients, sick with probably the cold or the seasonal flu, from hospitals to nursing homes in order to make room at the hospitals for all the COVID patients who never arrived. There, at the nursing homes, they then infected old people with a severely weakened immune system, usually as a result of pre-existing medical conditions. In addition, a vaccination, which had previously been administered, had further weakened the immune systems of the people in the nursing homes. So that explains what happened. There's other things that happened there. They forged the numbers. The World Health Organization installed one of their people in the Italian healthcare system, and this guy forged the numbers. There's a certain you have to do these, what is called pandemic preparedness maneuvers, or what do you call this, every 5 years or so. And the last one, it said, was conducted in 2016, but it wasn't. It was conducted in 2006. So that, if you add all of this together, this is a made-up pandemic, even in Italy. In New York, only some, but by far not all hospitals were overwhelmed. Many people, most of whom were, again, elderly and had serious pre-existing medical conditions, and most of whom would have stayed at home to recover from the flu had it not been for the panic reports, raced to the hospitals. There, many of them fell victim to healthcare-associated infections. They call them nosocomial infections on the one hand, and incidents of malpractice on the other hand, for example, by being put on a respirator rather than being given oxygen through an oxygen mask. Again, to clarify, COVID-19, this is the current state of affairs, is a dangerous disease, just like the seasonal flu is a dangerous disease. And of course, COVID-19, just like the seasonal flu, may sometimes take a severe clinical course and will sometimes kill patients. However, as autopsies have shown, which were carried out in Germany in particular by a man by the name of Professor Püschel of Hamburg University, the fatalities he examined had almost all been caused by serious pre-existing conditions, and almost all of the people who had died at a very old age, just like in Italy, meaning they had lived beyond their average life expectancy. In this context, the following should also be mentioned. The German equivalent of the American CDC had initially, strangely enough, recommended that no autopsies be performed. Why is that? And there are numerous credible reports that doctors and hospitals worldwide had been paid money for declaring a deceased person a victim of COVID-19 rather than writing down the true cause of death in the death certificate, for example, heart attack or a gunshot wound. Even people who tested positive and then got run over by a bus, COVID. Without the autopsies, we would never have known that the overwhelming majority of the alleged COVID-19 victims had died of completely different diseases, but not of COVID-19. Same is true in New York. 94% of the people who allegedly died of COVID died of completely other causes. Or in Sweden, 85% of the people who died of COVID died of completely other causes. The assertion that the lockdown was necessary because there were so many infections with SARS-CoV-2 and because the healthcare system would be overwhelmed is wrong for 3 reasons, as we have learned from the hearings we conducted with the Corona Investigative Committee, and also from other data that has become available in the meantime. A, lockdowns were imposed when the virus was already retreating. By the time the lockdowns were imposed, the alleged infection rates were already dropping again. B, there is already protection from the virus. This is something that hardly anybody seems to know, but there is already protection from the virus because of what is called cross or T-cell immunity. Apart from that, apart from these, from the fact that lockdowns came and the virus was already retreating, there is cross or T-cell immunity in the general population against the coronaviruses contained in every flu or influenza wave. Coronaviruses have existed for at least decades, probably much longer. This is true even if this time around a slightly different strain of the coronavirus was at work. Probably one, as we now know, that has been artificially created in a lab. Now, they used to think that it was done in a lab, and these gain-of-function experiments were conducted in a lab in Wuhan. In the meantime, there's a very concrete suspicion that it may have been conducted in one of the 30 American and German-funded bio labs in Ukraine. But it doesn't make a difference because the body's immune system remembers every virus, even if it has been tampered with, every virus which it ever battled in the past. And from this experience, it also recognizes a supposedly new but similar strain of the virus from the corona family. Again, even one that has been tampered with. And C, the PCR test is being used on the basis of false statements of facts with respect to infections. And that's the most important aspect of all of this. In the meantime, we have learned that these PCR tests, contrary to the assertions of Drosten, Fauci, and the World Health Organization, do not give any indication of an infection with any virus, let alone an infection with SARS-CoV-2. Not only are PCR tests expressly not approved for diagnostic purposes, and that's what they're being used for, as is correctly noted on inserts coming with these tests, and as the inventor, the real inventor of the PCR test, Kary Mullis, Nobel Prize winner, has repeatedly emphasized. Instead, they are simply incapable of diagnosing any disease. Why is that? A positive PCR test result doesn't mean that an infection is present. If someone is tested positive, it does not mean that they're infected with anything, let alone with the contagious SARS-CoV-2 virus. Even the United States CDC itself says that, and I quote directly from page 38 of one of its publications on the coronavirus and PCR tests dated July 13th, 2020. Direct quote, "Detection of viral RNA may not indicate the presence of infectious virus or that 2019 nCoV is the causative agent for clinical symptoms." It means there could be other reasons for clinical symptoms, but at least they're looking at symptoms. We're seeing that there was mass screening of perfectly healthy people, which they call asymptomatically infected. That is impossible. Second quote, "The performance of this test has not been established for monitoring treatment of 2019 nCoV infection." Third quote, "This test cannot rule out diseases caused by other bacterial or viral pathogens." Means if you test positive, you still have to find out where the symptoms, if you have any, if you don't have any, you're healthy, where the symptoms come from. It's, I think this is called differential diagnostics. Every doctor knows how to do this. You have to find out what causes these symptoms. If you're only looking for the coronavirus, then that's the only thing you find, because that's what it's designed to find, the coronavirus. But it could very well be, as the CDC itself admits, that something completely different caused the symptoms. Well, at least they're looking for symptoms. The PCR swabs take one or two sequences of a molecule that are invisible to the human eye and therefore need to be amplified in many cycles to make it visible. You know, the PCR test, the nose or the throat, you can't see what's on these swabs. Everything, now this is important, and you put this stuff into a machine, and that's where it gets amplified. Everything over 25 cycles of amplification, everything over 24 cycles of amplification is, as reported by the New York Times and others, considered completely unreliable and scientifically unjustifiable. At 35 cycles of amplification, you end up with roughly 97% false positives. That's what Mike Eden and all the others told us. And he knows what he's talking about, just like Professor Kemmerer of Würzburg University or Professor Capel from the Netherlands or another immunologist, Dolores Cahill, you may have heard of her. They all agree that at 35 cycles of amplification, you end up with roughly 90 to 97% false positives. However, the Drosten test, which was the blueprint for all the other PCR tests that the World Health Organization recommended worldwide, the Drosten tests that are set to between 40 and 45 cycles of amplification. It was guaranteed to produce cases, but false positive cases. Can that be because of the desire to produce as many positive results as possible, and thereby provide the basis for the false assumption that a large number of infections have been detected? The test cannot distinguish. There's two reasons why this test cannot, well, first of all, it's not approved for diagnostic purposes, and Kary Mullis, a really smart, witty guy who unfortunately died in August of 2019. He said this over and over again. This test cannot tell you if you're sick or if you're infected with anything. But there are two very logical reasons why this test cannot be used for diagnostic purposes. Reason number one, the test cannot distinguish inactive and reproductive matter, or dead and live matter. This is unscientific speaking. That means that a positive test result may happen because the test detects, for example, a piece of debris, a fragment of a molecule, which may signal nothing else than that the immune system of the person tested won a battle with the common cold 6 months ago. It tests positive because it finds the remnants of the virus, but it doesn't mean that it's active, that it's live. And for an infection of a person, you need a whole virus to enter the person's cells and to start replicating there. The test, however, does not find a whole virus because what is on the swabs is mashed or squashed before it's put into the machines. And it is thus impossible to find if there was ever a whole virus found. It only finds fragments. For these two reasons, it can't distinguish dead and live matter, and it cannot tell you whether a whole virus has entered the cells and started to replicate there. It cannot be used for diagnostic purposes. Now, Drosten, who was used as their messenger, World Health Organization's messenger for these messages, false messages, he himself declared in an interview with a German business magazine in 2014, at that time concerning the alleged detection of an infection with a MERS virus, which is another coronavirus, allegedly with the help of the PCR test, that these PCR tests are so highly sensitive that even perfectly healthy and non-infectious people may be tested positive. He said it himself in 2014. We have that article. At that time, he also became very much aware of the powerful role of panic-mongering media, as you'll see at the end of the following quote. He said in that interview, if, for example, such a pathogen scurries over the nasal mucosa of a nurse for a day or so, without her getting sick or noticing anything else, then she is suddenly a MERS case. This could also explain the explosion of case numbers in Saudi Arabia. In addition, he continues, the media there have made this into an incredible sensation. It sounds, now in hindsight, it sounds as though this is where he took his cues, and the World Health Organization took their cues. Well, the question is, has he forgotten all this, or is he deliberately concealing this in the corona context? Because corona is a very lucrative business opportunity for the pharmaceutical industry as a whole, and for a guy by the name of Alfred Land, really strange name, his co-author, Drosten's co-author in many studies. This guy is a PCR test maker. He's his business partner. In my view, it is completely implausible that he forgot in 2020 what he knew about the PCR tests and told a business magazine in 2014. In short, this test cannot detect any infection, contrary to all false claims stating that it can. An infection, a so-called, Mike Eden calls it a hot infection, requires that the virus is not just found somewhere, for example, in the throat of a person without causing any damage. That would be a cold infection. Rather, a hot infection, or dead and live material, a hot infection requires that the virus penetrates into the cells, replicates there, and causes symptoms. Symptoms such as a headache or a stomach ache or some symptoms, diarrhea, sore throat. Only then is a person really infected in the sense of a hot infection. And that is what we're really talking about. When we talk about infections, we mean people who are infected with the virus and who are contagious for others. That is what an infection is. Until then, it is completely harmless for both the host and all other people that the host comes into contact with. Once again, this means that positive test results, contrary to all other claims by Drosten, Fauci, and the World Health Organization, mean nothing with respect to infections, as even the CDC acknowledged, as quoted above. Meanwhile, a number of highly respected scientists worldwide assume that there has never been a corona pandemic, but only a PCR test pandemic. One such opinion is that of the aforementioned Dr. Mike Eden, former vice president and chief science officer at Pfizer. He held that position for 16 years. He and his co-authors of well-known scientists, European scientists, most of them, English, published a scientific paper in September of 2020. Among other things, he and they state, we are basing our government policy, now this is in September of 2020, We're basing our government policy, our economic policy, and the policy of restricting fundamental rights, presumably on completely wrong data and assumptions about the coronavirus. If it weren't for the test results that are constantly reported in the media, the pandemic would be over because nothing really happened. Of course, there are some serious individual cases of illness, but there are also some in every flu epidemic. There was a real wave of disease in March and April, that's the flu season, but since then everything has gone back to normal. Only the positive results rise and sink wildly again and again depending on how many tests are carried out. But the real cases of illness are over. There can be no talk of a second wave. That's what they said then. The allegedly new strain of the coronavirus, Dr. Mike Yeadon continues, only new in that it is a new type of the long-known coronavirus. There are at least 4 coronaviruses that are endemic and cause some of the common colds we experience, especially in winter. They have all striking sequence similarity to the coronavirus, and because the immune system, the human immune system, recognizes the similarity to the virus that has now allegedly been newly discovered, a T-cell immunity, that's what this is called. A T-cell immunity has long existed in this respect. 30% of the population had this before the allegedly new virus even appeared, T-cell immunity, because they remember the coronavirus from some common cold or flu that they battled. Therefore, it is sufficient for the so-called herd immunity, immunity of a whole population, that 15 to 25% of the population are infected with the allegedly new coronavirus to stop the further spread of the virus. And this has long since been the case. We've acquired herd immunity a long time ago. Regarding this all-important PCR test, Yeadon writes in a piece called Lies, Damn Lies, and Health Statistics, The Deadly Danger for False Positives, dated September 20th of 2020, the likelihood of an apparently positive case being a false positive is between 89 to 94%, or near certainty. Dr. Yeadon, in agreement with professors of immunology, Kammerer from Germany, Capel from the Netherlands, Cahill from Ireland, as well as the microbiologist Dr. Arve from Austria, all of whom testified before the German Corona Committee, explicitly point out that a positive test does not mean that an intact virus has been found. The authors explain that what the PCR test actually measures is it simply measures the presence of partial RNA sequences present in the intact virus, which could be a piece of dead virus which cannot make the subject sick and cannot be transmitted and cannot make anyone else sick. Because of the complete unsuitability of the test for the detection of infectious disease, it tested positive, as you may remember, in sheep, in goats, papayas, and even chicken wings. Oxford professor Carl Hennigan, director of the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine, writes that the coronavirus would never disappear if this test practice were to be continued, but would always be falsely detected in much of what is tested. Lockdowns, as Yeadon and his colleagues found out, and there's a huge study that was conducted by John Ioannidis, lockdowns do not work. Sweden, with its laissez-faire approach, and Great Britain, with its really strict lockdown, for example, have completely comparable disease and mortality statistics. The same was found by US scientists concerning the different US states. There's the example of North and South Dakota, for example.